Hi, and welcome to Enchantment of Eternity's review for the Jem'hadar, which is episode 26 of Season 2 of Star Trek Deep Space Nine. This video is a part of a series of videos where I review episodes of Star Trek as requested by my viewers. This episode was requested by Channel 4-1. So the Jem'hadar was the episode that begins with Jake trying to come up with an idea for a science project, and Commander Sisko offers to take him to the Gamma Quadrant on a camping trip to do a planetary survey. Sisko's so excited about being able to spend quality time with his son, but that turns sour when Jake insists that Nog come with them, as Mrs. O'Brien said it wouldn't be fair for Jake to have this advantage without giving some of the other kids a shot, and Nog's grades were slipping, so Jake guilts Sisko into saying yes. But when they go to leave, Quark insists on going with them. His excuse is to supervise Nog, but really he wants the opportunity to try to talk Sisko into letting him use the con system to sell merchandise. Once on the trip, Quark is nothing but a nuisance who annoys the hell out of everyone, including Nog. Eventually, Quark accidentally sets himself on fire by a campfire, and Nog runs away in frustration, and Jake goes after him to look after him. Where Sisko and Quark are alone, they encounter a strange alien with telekinetic powers who is running away from her chasers, who she calls the Jem'hadar. These scary aliens then appear out of thin air and surround them and hold them captive. While in prison, Sisko's Jem'hadar captor reveals he's a representative of an organization in the Gamma Quadrant known as the Dominion, and he demands that Starfleet and all of those from the Alpha Quadrant cease using the wormhole and coming through to go to the Gamma Quadrant immediately. In fact, he travels to Deep Space Nine, beams through their shields, and walks out of a containment field to inform Kira all of the Starfleet and Alpha Quadrant ships that they destroyed, including the Bajoran colony in the Gamma Quadrant. So Kira and visiting Starfleet ship, the Odyssey, come up with a plan to attack the Jem'hadar and rescue Sisko. Meanwhile, Jake and Nog unsuccessfully try to fly the runabout back to the station, while Quark and Sisko and the alien manage to escape. Kira and the Starfleet ship take on the Jem'hadar and manage to defeat them, while the runabouts rescue Sisko, Quark, Jake, and Nog. However, the Jem'hadar, instead of retreating, make a suicide run at the Odyssey to collide with it, thus destroying it. When they arrive back to the station with the alien woman, Quark discovers she was lying about being held captive, and when they go to put her in a prison cell, she says, "You have no idea what's begun here," and just beams out of nowhere as there's no ship nearby. And Sisko knows that the Dominion is a new, huge threat to the station and the safety of the Federation. So before Season 2 began, and a lot of the interviews and articles about Season 2 where they tried to hype up Season 2 and all the changes they were making to the show and making it better and more interesting, the producers talked about a menacing villain that they would be revealed in Season 2 that came from the Gamma Quadrant known as the Dominion. An adversary so powerful, they said it would rival the Borg. So all season long I was waiting for the Dominion to appear, and they were name dropped several times throughout Season 2, such as when the Ferengi attempt to open trade negotiations, they hear about a powerful organization known as the Dominion. And when Dax and Odo meet an old man who recreated his destroyed village with holograms, he reveals it was the Dominion that wiped out his world. But it wasn't until this episode that we actually meet the Dominion, and we do so through this powerful adversary, the Jem'hadar. And because I had been waiting all season to see this awesome new enemy, I convinced myself they were awesome before I even saw them. So I wanted to like this episode so much it kind of colored my opinion of it. So this episode introduces the Dominion as an adversary whose main soldiers are the Jem'hadar, a warrior race that has the ability to turn invisible, kind of like the Predator. In fact, they kind of look somewhat similar to the Predator now that I think about it, but more scaly. They also have technology that allows them to beam through shields, walk through containment fields, and transport over vast distances. And their ships are impervious to tractor beams, and they have powerful beam weapons able to penetrate the shields of a Galaxy-class starship. They have a very impressive espionage network, as they knew practically everything about the Federation and its affairs while remaining completely unknown to them. The Dominion is made up of many different species. The Jem'hadar serve as soldiers, and there's also another race that has telekinetic powers that are able to shoot a powerful orb from their minds as a weapon. The Jem'hadar apparently serve a group of leaders known as the Founders who rule the Dominion, but some believe the Founders are a myth. And their main purpose is to keep the Alpha Quadrant races from coming into the Gamma Quadrant and violating their territory. So that's how the Dominion were established in this episode. However, not all of these details were kept throughout the series run. In fact, many of these details were changed or forgotten. The first thing to change was the Dominion's motivation, as in the very next episode it changed from wanting to keep the Alpha Quadrant races out of the Gamma Quadrant to wanting to conquer the Alpha Quadrant. This change makes total sense, however, as I suppose the writers realized that the motivation didn't lead to many future stories, because if this was what the Dominion really wanted, all they needed to do was collapse the wormhole, or at the very least mine it like Cisco did in Season 5 to keep the Dominion out of the Alpha Quadrant. Also, many of the technologies I mentioned they had, such as transporters that can beam through shields, being able to walk out of containment fields, ships that were impervious to tractor beams, and shield-penetrating beam weapons, none of these were ever seen again after this episode. In fact, it was well established that the Dominion did not have these kind of technologies, so they tried to pretend that it never existed. A couple of technologies did survive, though, such as the Jem'hadar's ability to cloak themselves, which later became known as shrouding, and the Dominion possessing long-term transporters capable of beaming over vast distances, although these were rarely shown and only make a reappearance in Season 6 when Gul Dukat uses them because it was convenient for the plot at the time. Another thing completely forgotten about was the telekinetic powers of the race that later were revealed to be called the Vorta. These were also swept under the rug, and they pretended like these never existed. In fact, this episode kind of portrayed the Vorta as a different sort of warrior than the Jem'hadar that uses psychic weapons instead of brute strength. But later, the Vorta were portrayed as administrators that ruled over the Jem'hadar as representatives of the Founders. I'm actually disappointed by this, as the idea of psychic warriors is much more fascinating to me. Also, this episode implied that there were many different races that make up the Dominion. However, it's later established that the Founders genetically engineered the Jem'hadar to be warriors and the Vorta to be administrators, and they simply rule over many conquered worlds, which I think is a shame, as even the writers had stated that their original intention was to create an anti-federation that were made up of many diverse different alien species that make up the Dominion, and I think that sounded very interesting, so I'm a bit disappointed that it didn't quite live up to it, instead only focused on these three races. However, another thing they did keep in the future is the Founders, as what was established about them here does live up to what we get later on. In fact, I think it was brilliant the way they introduced the concept of the Founders in this episode, and even presented a counterbalance that they were mythical. And the fact that we'd later learn the Founders are in fact Odo's shape-shifting species, that would also explain how their intelligence network was so good, how they knew so much about the Alpha Quadrant, and whereas the Alpha Quadrant aliens had never heard of them. So this episode reminded me a lot of the Next Generation episode Q Who, where the whole point was to introduce a new menacing, powerful enemy, and just like Q Who, the enemy they introduced would later become vastly different than how they're portrayed in this episode, and also like Q Who, I felt their attempts to introduce and show off this new enemy are a bit contrived, as if the showrunners are screaming at me, "Ooh, check out this new enemy, aren't they cool?" So doesn't make for the best storytelling in my opinion. But that being said, I did think this episode did work effectively to create tension and introduce a powerful adversary that is in fact scary. However, they did realize they made them a bit too powerful in this episode, which was doubtless why they had made all these changes that I just mentioned. However, the battle scene with the DS9 crew running around in these dinky runabouts was a bit silly, because how menacing could these Jem'hadar be if they can't even destroy a few puny runabouts? And I suppose this is why they would introduce the Starfleet warship, the Defiant, in the very next episode. But let's talk about the elephant in the room regarding this episode. The commercials promised a high-tension episode that introduced this powerful enemy known as the Dominion, and for the first half hour of this episode, what we got was a fun, wacky, family-friendly episode of Sisko, Jake, Nog, and Quark going on a camping trip and where hijinks ensue. In fact, the few episodes worked so, this first part of this episode actually worked so well as a silly comedy, with Nog saying stuff like, oh, how do we fire the phasers, and Quark coming up with a clever scheme to get Sisko to allow him to operate his new business model. And then halfway through the episode, it all of a sudden changes to a high-tension, high-stakes episode where we see this vast alien empire capable of destroying the Federation, and where Sisko and Quark have to run for their lives. I actually found the first part of the episode quite funny. I must admit to laughing my ass off when Quark got caught on fire. But I must say, I thought the different tones clashed and it didn't flow seamlessly to make like an action comedy, and instead it felt like the writers couldn't decide on what the tone of the episode was and changed their minds halfway through. Also, the whole idea of taking Jake on a camping trip to an uncharted planet on the other side of the galaxy doesn't sound like a very safe or smart idea, as who knows what kind of dangers will be there, as is exemplified by what actually happened to them. Therefore, I officially deem Commander Sisko worst father of the year. However, it did make sense that Mrs. O'Brien mentioned it was unfair that Jake get to do this survey of an uncharted planet on the other side of the galaxy as a side project, just because his daddy is the station commander, and that is, and it was right for her to point it out that some other kids in the class should get the same opportunity. Of course, Nog is the only one who uses this opportunity, but of course that's because the other children at the school are not main or recurring characters on the show Star Trek Deep Space Nine. Although I did like the interactions between Sisko and Quark in this episode, as Quark was constantly accusing Sisko of being prejudiced against Ferengi, and most of the stuff he said was nonsense, but he did make a few good points here and there, and I think Sisko even recognizes as he stuck up for Quark when Eris wanted to leave him behind, so that was a nice character development story. So my rating for the Jem'hadar out of 10 is an 8, extremely good. I did think this episode worked well in introducing a powerful and menacing enemy, and it was quite suspenseful and did successfully end the season on a sense of dread, and a lot of the Quark and Nog stuff was effectively funny. But some of the action sequences were subpar and a bit too over the top, and the comedic and dramatic parts of this episode did not mix well, and I feel they failed to correctly mesh these tones. So that's it for my review of the Jem'hadar. Unfortunately, I am no longer taking episode review requests at this time. However, I still have an episode review pending, which I will get to next week, and will continue to do many more videos on Star Trek, as well as many more videos on other shows like Game of Thrones, Humans, Vikings, The Walking Dead, and more. So be sure to subscribe so you can keep up with all of that. Thanks a lot for watching.